Hello and welcome to Snide's Return, a tabletop roleplay podcast. My guest today has become a stable member of the TTRPG design community with an edge over so many others. His mind is capable of retaining large volumes of data like an encyclopedia Cobra Commander. This is no laughing matter, however. Well, unless dragons are involved, I guess. As his mind hisses and rattles with a creative essence, like a cobra ready to strike. And by strike, I actually mean while the iron is hot, with a desire to adventure. We need only pony up a little cash to upshift our gaming experience to see if the horseshoe fits, and yell, "Yo, Joe!" because knowing is half the battle. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome TTRPG content creator, game designer, animation creative lead, and GI Joe superfan, from what I can see behind you, Ryan Costello. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Adam. Wow, that was very detailed. I am impressed already with your pre-show research.
Well, thank you very much. Well, before we get into some of the things I alluded to there in the introduction, Ryan, why don't you tell us how you got into tabletop role-playing games, please?
Sure. Well, in high school, I was on a whale watching trip. It was a field trip that some of the students went on, and there was a lot of downtime because it was like a 3-day trip, but only one day would be on the boat looking for the whales. And so in that downtime, one of my classmates brought up Dungeons and Dragons, which I knew the name from the 80s cartoon and was vaguely aware that it was a game because of advertisements in comics that I had. But I had never played a role-playing game, and I really didn't know what a role-playing game was. So most of that trip was spent with him explaining how role-playing games work, and then him running me through a very bare-bones version of the game because we didn't have dice, we didn't have rules, but we could role-play. We could create scenarios and engage with them. I could create a character in theory. And that really hooked me in. And so shortly thereafter, when we got home, he shared books with me. I started coming up with ideas for my first adventure because I really had the GM bug was already bit me. And so from there, I started running regular Dungeons and Dragons sessions at my high school lunch during our lunch break. And really, role-playing games have been part of my life in some way since then.
Wow. To get bitten by the GM bug so early, I both admire and feel kind of sorry for you in that respect. Does that mean you spent all your time behind the screen?
No, I actually did a fair amount of alternating because I had joined a group that already had a couple of established GMs, and they'd already established a formula for their campaign where it was just someone would run for a couple of weeks and then their idea would run out and somebody would take over. And most players had more than one character. So it really was just kind of like swapping between this giant roster of characters and GMs. So that worked out well because it meant I could do my first adventure and then recover from my first adventure and figure out where to go from there.
Well, where did you go from there? Where did D&D lead next within a hobbyist / sort of TTRPG sort of through line for your life?
Now, for most of my life, I've only been a single game player enthusiast. So basically, it was Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition at the time. And then when that kind of wore on, I picked up the Marvel, what's known now as Face Rip, but the 80s, 90s Marvel role-playing game with the like percentage chart on the back. Played a lot of Marvel role-playing games. And then that evolved to my first game design, where it was barely designed because I just took the chart Marvel had done and then adapted it to a pro wrestling role-playing game, which was based on the WWE, but in real time. So if a storyline happened on the weekly show, that would affect our role-playing game. And so it was a very chaotic campaign. We were constantly adjusting to things that were happening, but it also was really easy to engage with because we were all fans of the product, and it meant that we were always up to date.
Yeah. Sorry, no, that's an amazing way of tying in sort of two different medium and sort of keeping things fresh, I suppose, I just had to say I was impressed with that, to be honest.
I even got my brother into the game who was not into role-playing games or wrestling.
Wow, good effort. Sorry, please continue. So after crafting, creating, manipulating this game from the WWE, where did that lead to?
So after that, for a couple of years, my interest in role-playing games dropped off, and I got more into collecting action figures as a hobby and into more into comics, which I'd already been in, but like just kind of leveled up as a comic collector. But then Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition came out. And funny enough, the friend that introduced me to Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition, I bumped into him on the bus, and he brought up, hey, this third edition is coming out, and here's all the ways it's different, and here's all the ways it's better. We should start a campaign. And I didn't end up starting a campaign with him, but rather with a lot of other people that we played in high school with. And so we got all into third edition Dungeons & Dragons a couple of years into its publishing life. And then 3.5 was announced. And we were like, we just got these books. And at the time, we were all students, and 3 hardcover books was the most our gaming budget could afford. But slowly over time, as new 3.5 books were coming out, we would buy into the new ones, and then we would replace some of the core rule books. For a while, we were playing a hybrid of 3 and 3.5. And then we got all into 3.5. At one point, we just said, let's put the third edition stuff aside and just play one version of this game. And we got all into that. And that's around when I discovered podcasting. And I was like, I want to get into podcasting. This is really an interesting hobby of its own and something I'm passionate about. Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 edition. I'm going to create a podcast completely dedicated to this, really, free advertisement for Wizards of the Coast, but whatever. I really like this. And then 4th edition was announced. And so there's this podcast that was almost ready to go, almost ready to record the first episode. One of my friends who's more tech savvy was going to be the co-host and handle the production as he taught me to do production so that I could eventually take it over. So yeah, everything was ready except for recording. And now suddenly our concept had to change. And so we went from a Dungeons & Dragons fan cast to specifically a Dungeons & Dragons 3.5. We are the people that are keeping this dead edition alive. Which it ended up being. We weren't the only people keeping that dead edition alive. Paizo, I assume that your listeners know the story of how Paizo came to be and how they converted from a magazine publisher and a license to produce Dungeons & Dragons magazine. Then they became their own publisher of their own original game, Pathfinder. And so I got hooked into Pathfinder in the same way that the transition from 3.0 to 3.5 was pretty seamless. 3.5 to Pathfinder was just as seamless. I was really engaged with the product, and I was really engaged with the company. And because they were just kind of making a name for themselves, and I was like, hey, we've got a podcast. Here's what a podcast is. We want to dedicate a podcast to this brand new game you have put out. And so it was very easy to get interviews with the creators, and we established a very good relationship. And then over the last 15 years, we have had this incredible relationship with Paizo, where the No Direction Network is like the go-to place for Pathfinder news, reviews, and interviews.
Nice. Well, saying that and sort of spinning it back to you, where can we find you and all the things you're associated with, please, Ryan?
My main thing that I will plug is the stuff related to my podcast network. So if you go to nodirectionpodcast.com, that is, even though the name says podcast, it's actually for the full No Direction Network, which includes at any given time about 10 different podcasts, all of them related to gaming, most of them related to Pathfinder, but we've also got a Starfinder podcast, which is the sci-fi fantasy version of Pathfinder. We've got Game Design Unboxed with Danielle Reynolds, which is a tabletop board game podcast, and we've just recently relaunched Upshift, which is an Essence20 specific podcast that I co-host. And we've also got about a dozen blogs. Basically, any given day you will find either a blog, a podcast, or both on the nodirectionpodcast.com.
All right. I will make sure that there are links to that down in the description below this podcast. We can also find you on a few other sort of locations on social media. One of them we will get to very shortly, in fact. So you mentioned there going through the D&D editions, going into Pathfinder and having that strong relationship with Paizo. Going back to something you mentioned in amongst all of that was getting into collecting action figures and comics. I can see behind you, and I feel sorry for those that are listening to this and don't have the view I do. The plethora of action figure collections behind you, models and things. When did that really sort of kick off, and when did you sort of zero down your focus on one specific brand, should we say?
So, zeroing in on one specific brand, me and GI Joe have had a good relationship my entire life, because I was born in 1980. The real American hero version of GI Joe came out in 1982. So I had my first GI Joe earlier than I had my first memory. So GI Joe's always been a part of my life. And GI Joe, unusual for the time, went 12 years. It went from 1982 to 1994. And so in high school, I was still buying and playing with the original GI Joe line when everyone else in my life had long passed it. In fact, one of the last figures that came out was called the Monstro Viper, and it was just this giant looked more like a Ninja Turtle than a GI Joe, but he was actually the villain of my first Dungeons Dragons campaign. I used him as the miniature because he towered over everyone else. He would have been 40 feet tall. So there was a fun crossover right there as GI Joe was ending, and as I was getting to Dungeons and Dragons. That monster viper will always mean a lot to me. And so it ended in 1992. Oh, no, sorry. It ended in 1994. And within a couple of years, the internet became a much more prevalent thing. And one of the first things I looked up was G.I. Joe, because even though it had only been a couple of years since the toy line ended, the difference between being a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old, those 2 years were gigantic. And it had been much longer since the cartoon had gone offline. So I just was curious what was out there on this internet thing about G.I. Joe. And it ends up quite a lot because some of the early adopters to the internet were apparently very big G.I. Joe fans. And so yojo.com was already this go-to resource for what the G.I. Joe, like the go-to resource for G.I. Joe hobbyists. And from there, I found a site called joecustoms.com, which was just people who would take G.I. Joes apart, rebuild them, paint them, create new backstories. Basically, they were role-playing without a role-playing game. They were creating new characters for the G.I. Joe universe. And that ended up being my the main forum that I interacted with. So that's where I built most of my friendships in the G.I. Joe community. And then a couple of years later, eBay became a thing. And around that same time, I was getting my first part-time job. So I had some disposable income and access to toys that were not on shelves anymore. And so I was like, well, I know what I'm going to get. And so I spent hundreds of dollars that I should not have on G.I. Joes. But it means that I got things like my complete terror drone up there, which right now costs thousands of dollars to get in that condition. And I managed to get it for, I think, about $500, which was a lot of money then. But, it was an investment, which was surprising. Most of the time when I was buying Joes, it was like, I just love the feel of getting these Joes again. But as it turns out, they've actually become quite expensive collector's items over the last 5 years. And so I could theoretically sell my collection and make a profit, which was never something I expected. G.I. Joe was so common and prolific of a toy that you could get secondhand ones super cheap. And it just never struck me that these would eventually increase in value.
Going around sort of boot fairs and sort of small markets, you could always see sort of kids who would finish playing with action figures and GI Joes and things like that and pick them up. I should have been picking them up and putting them in a box and selling them to you by the sounds of it. But how did your love for TTRPGs and your love for GI Joe, when did that synergize into where we can find your work now?
So that really happened quite recently. Like I had theories about what a GI Joe role-playing game might look like, and I'd even kit bashed a couple and even ran a one-shot at a GI Joe Canadian GI Joe convention one year, but never with any long-term plan of what I would do with it. I did not know the first thing about licensing, so I really did not believe I would make an official GI Joe role-playing game. But I guess in theory, I could have seen it as after I finished making the game, then I file off the serial numbers and just release a not G.I. Joe, but it's G.I. Joe role-playing game. And there are several games like that are out there, but for some reason, I never actually engaged with any of them. I don't know why. I knew they were out there, but they didn't interest me. But then a couple of years ago, it was announced on all of the RPG news sites that Renegade had the license for G.I. Joe. And it wasn't even clear that they had the RPG license. It said that they definitely had the Power Rangers RPG license. And they also had license to produce games based on G.I. Joe, Transformers, and My Little Pony. And like, this is not the first time we've heard this kind of thing. A few years before that, Wizards of the Coast announced that they had the rights to make miniatures based on G.I. Joe, Transformers, My Little Pony. And they made Transformers, and they made My Little Pony. They never got around to G.I. Joe. It's even though at one point it was probably the most popular toy line in the world, it never had a second wind like Transformers and My Little Pony did. So in the G.I. Joe community, we were kind of used to it being the I don't know, the unloved third child of the Hasbro family. And Power Rangers only came in after the fact because they bought into that. So this announcement came up, and then a couple of days later, there was a similar announcement saying that Renegade had hired Elisa Teague as to head their new RPG division. And so that's when I got to work. I was like, all right, so I have a lot of connections in the RPG industry through my podcast at this point. So how many steps am I removed from Elisa? I found out that I was technically 0 steps away because she and I had played in a celebrity game together at one point, and I forgot. Anyway, and so I found out we were 2 steps away. She worked for Mike Sellinger for a long time. Mike Sellinger produced the Pathfinder adventure card game, and we had Mike on the podcast several times, and Mike really enjoyed us. So I asked him if he could put in a good word for me. Unconnected, I actually have a friend who works at Hasbro named Tom Sargent, which is like the perfect name for a guy that works at Hasbro. Yeah. And I said, like, do you mind if could I put you as a reference on my resume that I send in? Because saying like, I'd like to work for your role-playing game, and here's a guy who works at Hasbro who could vouch for me, that felt like a flex that not many other people could do. And he said, sure. And it ends up they never even called him, but I don't know if just having him on there really impressed. But in any case, I put together this resume saying like, here's everything I've done in the RPG industry. Here's everything I do related to GI Joe. And it wasn't just I like GI Joe and I've got these credits in the RPG industry. It's like, and I've also got this podcast. So if you want further like social media engagement, I could potentially do this whole package that I've done for Pathfinder. I could repeat that for Essence20. And on the GI Joe side, it's like, I like GI Joe. I have helped run these Canadian GI Joe conventions. I used to write for the Canadian GI Joe convention newsletter. And I've even written these articles about GI Joe for various news sites, including one that was all talking about the diversity of GI Joe, which I knew was a priority for Renegade. So just saying that, like, philosophically we line up, my interests line up with what you are doing right now, and there's potential for even more. Like, I really do think I am the person for this job. And Renegade agreed, and they got in touch with me. They brought me onto the team. And the only hitch was that originally these were going to be based on 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, which I had zero experience with, which I know sounds weird. But like I said, I'm like a single game system at a time type of guy. And I've been all in on Pathfinder for the last 15 years. Recently switched over to Pathfinder 2nd edition, which I was not as invested in as I was in Pathfinder 1st edition, but still, it was what was occupying my time and not Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. So that was the only hitch on my resume, that it's like, I've worked on a lot of role-playing games, just not this specific system, which turned out to be just fine when it ended up changing. They changed course, and we weren't basing Essence20 on Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition anymore.
Yeah. It's a decision that I'm glad was made, to be honest, but that's a personal preference. So you're put down as one of the sort of the game designers for the Essence20 system. So seeing the property, the IPs that you love, especially GI Joe, and this new system being created, what was it like? Sort of, was it very much hand in glove as the system complemented what you were hoping to see from the TTRPG that you've helped create?
So it was very different from the one that I had originally conceived. Like the GI Joe RPG I thought up in my spare time. That one was more about like, here's your here's a statistic. You either are all the way right or all the way left, and in a situation where it's like stubbornness. So like, if you are very stubborn, then in certain situations that will be to your benefit, but in other situations, like when you're supposed to be listening to the chain of command, that could be against you. And it was going to be this like swinging statistic system that was more about the storytelling of like how who you are affects how you interact with the world. Whereas the Essence20 is much more combat simulator, very much in line with Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, and more of the games I have experience with. So I'm actually better at that kind of thing. I just liked the concept of the other one that I had come up with, more for the, as the creative expression of an idea for a role-playing game. So where was I going with that? Oh yeah, so then we were building the Essence20 system together, and because we knew right away it had to serve at least 3 masters, with those being Power Rangers, GI Joe, and Transformers. With My Little Pony on the horizon, it was pretty much decided My Little Pony would also be Essence20. And then just in theory, any other license we could get ideally would also be Essence20. And so at one point in the redrafting of this new system, Elisa basically set out, like, we need to make sure that if we make a superhero game, it's compatible with superheroes. If we made this genre is this genre. And so I kind of took everything we had put together at that point and just kind of like rearranged it, laid it out as like, all right, so this is how it'll work for Power Rangers. And we need to make sure that Origins, whatever that means mechanically, it has different meaning for every different system that fits the setting. So for Power Rangers, that's how we ended up, that Origins is your attitude, because Power Rangers are teenagers with attitude. GI Joe was super simple. It was the military service. Then Transformers was the one that was a little bit stranger, because it's like, we probably need that to be your robot chassis, even though that means it has more weight than in the other systems. But ultimately we decided that's not a bad thing if different games have different weights for the different mechanical choices you're making along the way. And so then it was also like, all right, so this is if this was a superhero role-playing game, then your origin would be your origin. It is, are you a mutant? Are you a millionaire? Are you an alien? Are you a robot? And so on and so forth, going down all the different licenses we could theoretically have. And that was really fun and fascinating because I just assumed that if these games ever got role-playing games based on them, they'd each have their own system that is specific to their needs. And instead we found this really strong core that addresses everything that they have in common, and then found a way to adjust that core to make it to represent what each setting has unique to it.
Yeah. So the focusing on the GI Joe role-playing game specifically, just for a moment, I have it open on the PDF on my screen in front of me, and a few of the other bits and pieces that have been released. The artwork, first and foremost, is amazing. Looking through the book, I was told by Brian that you have, hence why the reference in the introduction, an encyclopedic knowledge about who could be used and what characters were accessible and sort of. Did you just pour your heart and soul into these pages so we could enjoy them ourselves? Because there is so much fantastic content in just this core rulebook on its own, and there is so much more coming.
So I mean, obviously I didn't work alone. Me, Ben, actually, what's Ben's last name? Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman. We were the 3-person GI Joe team. And it was when it was going to be a 5th edition book, they were a really strong get for the book because they were both experienced Dungeons & Dragons designers, and I was just going to be the lore guy. And so I really did put a lot of time working on the lore for the game. And then when it was reset and we had to redo everything mechanically that we'd done, most of what I'd done for lore still applied. And so then I was able to like re-engage with the book, but on another level, on a mechanical level. So I ended up getting my fingerprints in more parts of this game than I expected, which is why there is so much GI Joe references and some deep cuts, some things that most fans should recognize, some things that you might have forgotten, but like I've brought them back up as like memorable once you remember them. And then there's other elements that are really just, if you are me, you really enjoy these jokes that I've peppered in there. Like I can throw in an example. If you go to Destro, he's on page 254, and you read his bio, it's talking about how in the past the god of war was known as Ares, Horus, Moru, but today Destro is his name. Now, that should probably be, now today his name is Destro, or its name is Destro or something, but the original Destro toy had a featured advertisement, and the featured advertisements would have original theme songs, and the Destro theme song is like, Destro is his name, Destro is his name. And so it's like, all right, so I've got to take that line, Destro is his name, and I have to work this sentence over and over again until it doesn't sound too awkward, so that I am pleased with the fact that I've made this reference to this Destro cartoon, this Destro commercial. And honestly, any given line you can look at, and there's probably at least 2 layers of like, this is what it means for the game, this is what it means to me as a GI Joe fan.
That is amazing. To be perfectly honest, that is amazing. I was just so on page 8, General Hawk's debriefing. It gives a brief introduction to help the more casual GI Joe fan or new people coming into the property just understand who the threats. That's something we can get onto in a bit. And then there's like I think it's over 100 Joes, just snapshot introduction, who they are.
Yeah, I believe it's 81 of them, but like it says in a sidebar later, that was cut down from like 500 original characters in this property. And even some of the ones that I really wanted in there didn't make the cut. Because there's some that actually absolutely had to. There's the A list, but then the B list of GI Joe characters is very long. And I like people on the C, D, E list. And so like every now and then I would pepper in an E list character, but for the most part, I was just putting in the characters that everyone would either recognize or that they served a very specific purpose being on the roster of characters.
And further through the content, there's an example, like there is in the other Essence20 books, there's an example of entry at the back to really help GMs sort of step new players and themselves into running the system. What was it like structuring these adventures for new players and new GMs?
So, as luck would have it, I actually wrote that adventure. I was not supposed to. Originally, it was going to be Paige that wrote the adventure, which makes sense. She's won awards for the adventures she's written for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. But then when we shifted from the original plan to an original system, we also extended the deadline for our turnovers, and the extended deadline she was no longer available for. So she was able to do her original commitment, but then after that, me and Ben had to do more of the heavy lifting. And so this is something that I had an idea for. And so I pitched it to Elisa, just saying, like, what if it starts with just like your brand new Joes and you're given full run of the pit? The rest of the GI Joe team is off somewhere. In my head, they were off to the Statue of Liberty because Cobra Commander was trying to blow it up. So the opening scene from the GI Joe movie, that is where everyone else is. And that's why it's the player characters and one named Joe. That is their liaison. So this gave us an opportunity to lay out the entire pit, which is an area that it's the GI Joe headquarters. And so in theory, a lot of your adventures or a lot of your time between adventures is going to take place here. So having this all laid out, every single room that's in there and multiple things you can do in each room, that doesn't just serve this adventure. That serves everyone's campaigns at all levels of the campaign. So that was a priority. And so once I knew that we absolutely had to have a fully decked out pit, it had to only be a short adventure because it's an introductory adventure at the back of a core rulebook. I knew that the pit wasn't just where we were starting the adventure, the pit would be the location of the entire adventure. And so I had to come up with, like, all right, Cobra getting into the pit is a big deal. Like, this has happened a couple of times in the comics, and it's like, all right, well, now we have to scrap this headquarters, we have to move somewhere else, which obviously was not what we wanted, since I just explained that I want this to be the pit for every campaign. So it's like, all right, so we need Cobra characters to be infiltrating the pit, but we need some reason that this isn't then the end of that pit. And so it became the scenario of, like, this rejected Cobra officer was trying to get back in the good graces of Cobra Commander. So he has come across this intel, and instead of just handing it over, he really wants to prove himself by going into the pit and, like, sabotaging it himself and really, like, hitting it off in a big way, like marking his return to Cobra in a big way. And so then it was just really a matter of finding some interesting characters that I could include in there, spread it out across multiple rooms, and try and pace it to be a fairly easy adventure because it is first level. And it's not only first level, but it's the GM and the players are, in theory, learning the system for the first time. So I didn't want it to actually be challenging, and I really didn't want any characters getting defeated, and I absolutely did not want this to be a total party kill scenario. So so it's just some low-level threats spread out. I added a lot of personality to make up for the fact that they aren't especially threatening threats. And and I don't tend to write adventures. Like, I have very few published adventures, and I don't even write my own adventures when I run them. I just kind of ad hoc all adventures. So the fact that I had to write a whole adventure was outside of my wheelhouse, and it's gotten specifically called out as one of the strengths of this rulebook, which makes me feel pretty good about myself because it was not something I expected to even be doing, let alone doing well.
Well, no, one of the really good things, and you mentioned it there, you rather undersold yourself in that respect when you mentioned it's the group and a Joe, a named Joe. The Transformers Essence20 core rule book, Jazz is your point of contact. In the Power Rangers book, Alpha 5 is your point of contact. In this, in the Snake Pit, you get the GM gets to choose the NPC. He gets to choose which Joe, and that can flavor this whole thing to the GM. And I think that is brilliant. That you can either have the GM pick his own favorite, or you can tailor this more to a style based on which NPC, which named Joe, as you mentioned, you use to support the group. I think that's like perfect in introductory adventure territory, and I'm amazed nowhere else does it, to be honest. And that's not just Essence20. I mean across other adventures and systems and things like that gives you an option on how you want to tailor the adventure through a guided NPC. I think that's I can't give you any more plaudits because this would drag on for forever. But I think that is brilliant.
Cool. I can't really. It wasn't some like brainstorm moment, or like it wasn't some epiphany moment that I was like, oh, I should do it this way. It was just you will need an NPC. We'll let the GM decide the NPC. I did not really think it would be a revolutionary thing that I added to the adventure there.
Well, I think it is. That's a personal. That's more me. So at the moment, with respect to the game, and we'll sort of dip in and out of various parts. We've got the core rulebook. The GM screen is coming out. There's an adventure with that.
Oh, no, GM screen is out.
Oh, is it physically out? Okay.
It is physically out. I have a copy. It's not too buried. Let me grab it. Oh, here's Emerald Oubliette, the adventure that comes with it.
I was about to say it comes with its own adventure. But...
And there we go. There's the GM screen. So it uses a lot of the GI Joe classified art, which is the name of the current toy line.
Very nice.
It's got our original layout, yeah.
So there's this. So that's what is currently available. The core rulebook, the GM screen with an adventure. There's a combat flow diagram you can pick up from the Renegade website to help you sort of structure your way through combat if you need help with that. And there's also character sheets available. What else is coming for this particular line in the Essence20 system?
Sure. Well, if we stick to digital content, there's a couple of other things that are out there. There are pre-generated characters for Snake Eyes, Duke, Scarlet, and Roadblock. So the main four are cover heroes. You can go to the Renegade website. You can get pre-generated characters of them. So if you want to run Snake Pit and you want to just kick it off, you don't even want to do a character creation session, you can download those four pre-generated characters. It's not the most balanced party because there are two commandos, an officer, and a vanguard. And vanguard is kind of like combo officer and infantry. So it's not a whole lot of variety, and there's no dedicated healer in the group. But it's Snake Eyes, Scarlet, Duke, and Roadblock. Like, that's the buy-in, not what their build is, but who these characters are. And one other thing that's not technically a GI Joe product, but the Power Rangers role-playing game has the threat creation guide online. It is about a 10-page PDF that I wrote, and Renegade released it so that you could create your own threats for the Power Rangers role-playing game. But really, you can create any threats for any Essence20 role-playing game. This is specifically geared towards Power Rangers in the examples it uses, and it would probably go into a little more detail in a few different areas for GI Joe and specifically Transformers. Transformers would get a little more information about how to do alt modes and whatnot. But for the most part, you could create Essence20 threats using that guide, not just Power Rangers threats. So if you look at the threats section in the back and you're just like, my favorite's not there, or just not enough, or I need like a cool level 3 boss type character and the book doesn't have that, you can use that threat guide to create those threats.
Yeah. Well, another great resource that I highly recommend is the Renegade Discord server, which you and a few of the and the other team members of the team, that's the word I'm going for, also frequent. There's threads for threat creation and sort of hints and tips, and just a great support network, I guess, is the best way to phrase it on that Discord server.
So me and Brian do a lot of answering rules questions, clarifying some things, and if somebody asks us a question where like, that doesn't make sense, you're right, then it gets flagged for errata, and we'll usually have like, here's how to run it for now while we address this in official capacity. And the members of the Discord, like, not people who work for Renegade, just fans, are great about like pinning anytime me and Brian have a rules pertinent comment on there. And so if you have a question, you can just go to the board related to the game that you want to know the answer to, check the pins, and it goes through a whole, like, it's like a second FAQ. There's the FAQ on the website, but this one is much more active and alive, and it's a little more casual. So like if you're looking for really hard rules, go to the one on the website. But if you're just looking for like someone to even acknowledge that the rule that you have a question about has been asked before, it's pinned somewhere in one of those message boards.
Yeah, 100%. I think one of them that's come up the most that I've noticed is using things like transferring the GI Joe's machine gun rules across into like Transformers and things like that. That seems to be, but it just shows how flexible and how malleable the system is, and how seamless the transition between the various IPs and releases is, that you can take property from one and easily just shift it into the other to support the gaming style you want in that particular IP. So
I just want to address the machine gun thing, because that is entirely my fault. After the after the Transformers book had been turned over, at that point, it wasn't ready for publication, and so I offered to go in and do another pass. Like, as paid freelance work. It was basically, I wasn't on the Transformers team. I knew there were some problems with their rule book, and so I offered to be the one to fix it. And so I did a lot of rewriting of the origins and the roles. And one of the things I did was add a rule that if you are, it's the Rainmaker, right? I believe it's the Rainmaker that
right,
you automatically start with a machine gun, and then later you upgrade it to a heavy machine gun. Because I knew that they had ported over the equipment list from GI Joe. What I didn't know is that they had taken out some things from the GI Joe list, including both the heavy machine gun and the machine gun. So 2 specific items that I flagged as being core part of this origin were not in the core rulebook. And so that was easy to just say, all right, sorry, that's on me. Here's those rules. They're even formatted in the Transformers format, because GI Joe just uses one giant 2-page table, whereas Transformers did everything like it has its own tiny stat block, which I think is a cleaner look, and in retrospect kind of wish GI Joe had done that. But anyway, so I did a Transformers style stat block for the GI Joe machine gun and heavy machine gun, and unfortunately it didn't make it into print, but it's everywhere we could post it on social media saying, by the way, we know about this, here's the answer to that problem.
There you go. So if you are looking for that, come and join the Discord, and you can find it there. Ryan is there, Brian is there, but I'm not at work. I'm sort of hidden, lurking normally. So we mentioned everything that has come before and is out now. What is next in the line? What are we sort of looking towards months down the line from where we are now with respect to GI Joe releases?
So I cannot say when we can expect these down the line, because even as we've seen with the core rulebooks that are out, like the Transformers role-playing game, the physical book hasn't even gotten to customers' hands yet, even though we've given people the PDF for over a month at this point. So like these books exist, but they are at a printer, or they are on a ship, or they are on a dock, or they are in a warehouse. It's just the shipping situation right now. And so I cannot promise when these books will get into your hand, but we do have, Renegade has announced 2 books for the GI Joe role-playing game that are still to come. There is Operation Cold Iron, which is a 4-part mission book. I believe it's 128 pages. It's 4 32-page missions that are thematically linked, but can each be run individually. And they bring in a lot of classic vehicles, like as Cold Iron suggests, there is an Arctic scene. And so it brings in the Snowcat, which was one of my favorite vehicles as a kid. And it brings in the Polar Battle Bear, which is like, an armored snowmobile and the precursor to the Snowcat. And as the artwork has been previewed for the cover, and right there front and center is the snake armor, which, depending on if you watch the cartoon or the comic, in the cartoon it was kind of presented as just a robot, but the toy itself says that it's something that you encase around a Cobra soldier and like make him a Cobra super soldier. It's almost like a tiny mech suit. And then the comic introduced the idea that, oh no, this is a prison, that you capture somebody, you trap them inside, and then the robotic parts drag somebody into the battle. And while the robot's fighting, you don't want to fight back because your friend's inside there. And so I got to stat out 3 different versions of the snake armor as either a robot, a mobile prison, or a super armor. And all 3 versions are going to be in Operation Cold Iron at different points throughout the different adventures.
That's amazing. Well, whenever they are available, I will be picking those up, because I can't help myself with these things, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's one of the 2 releases that has been announced. The other one is the Cobra Codex. So this is a Cobra dedicated source book. If you are making, or if you're interested in playing a Cobra character or a whole Cobra campaign, that's what the Cobra Codex is for. But also, if you are a GM and you're looking for more information on Cobra Codex is for that. And if you want stat blocks for even more threats than we have in the core rulebook, we have both GI Joe threats and Cobra threats, including new Cobra vehicles that are in the Cobra Codex. So it is 1 part a campaign setting book, because it can work as backstory for a GI Joe campaign, or the entire campaign book for a Cobra-centric campaign. And plus, it's got all kinds of new options. And just like if you're making a Cobra character, you can use options from the GI Joe role-playing game core rulebook for your character. In fact, you have to, because there's no roles in the Cobra Codex. It's just new focus options for the roles that are in the GI Joe book. And it's also reverse compatible. If you see an option in the Cobra Codex that fits your GI Joe character, you can take it, you can move back, just ignore any mentions of evil in the description, but you can use the rules and the concept overall for characters going both ways.
Oh, that's amazing. So I guess before we move on to the other IP we've mentioned, and your involvement with that, and interesting crossovers that I might inquire about. While we're on the topic of GI Joes, favorite Joe, favorite vehicle, and favorite Cobra operative, please.
All right. So I narrowed down my favorite Joe to like a top 10 list, and each rank on the top 10 list has about 3 different Joes. So, like, I could say my absolute favorite Joe is Flint because he's the guy, he was my guy growing up as a kid. He's cooler than Duke. I liked his action figure more. I liked Bill Ratner's voice better than Michael Bell's on the original cartoon. Um, but really, like, objectively looking back, and it's like, he's just one of those 80s the main character types. He doesn't have a whole lot of depth to him. He's got some fun scenes, he's got some fun lines, but he's not particularly interesting. So a character like Snake Eyes is much more interesting. He's got a lot more depth to his backstory. Or Storm Shadow is one of my favorite characters because that's when I first saw that you could tell a story through action figures, because the original Storm Shadow is a Cobra character, and then the second Storm Shadow is a Joe. And this was not explored on the cartoon, which was the only GI Joe media that I was exposed to at the time. I didn't read the comic. And so the comic fleshes this whole thing out. This is like a 4-year storyline where Storm Shadow leaves Cobra, becomes kind of his own man, and then eventually becomes a GI Joe operative. But I didn't know that. So all I knew was used to be a bad guy. Now he's a good guy. What's all this stuff? Like reading over his file card as much as possible and just like filling the blanks, bridging the connection between two characters that or two action figures that came out 4 years apart that just tell the story of this one character. Like it got me so much more invested in the GI Joe lore than I had been before that. So those are like 3 of my top 10. That's really like a top 50. I also throw out Sergeant Slaughter is just a amazing novelty.
Yeah.
The idea that he was like the celebrity that they brought onto the team, but it's not like Jackie Chan Adventures where it's a whole TV show dedicated to this one guy. No, it's like one guy on the team is based on a real celebrity, but he's not real because he's a wrestler and it's a fake persona that's been imported over. Like, it's just a bizarre rabbit hole that the more you go down it, the more interesting it becomes. And Sergeant Slaughter is so into it. And when you watch the G.I. Joe movie again, like Sergeant Slaughter delivers some of the best lines. He's one of the best actors in that movie. And it's just like, it's a delight listening to Sergeant Slaughter play that character. I prefer him as a Joe than I do as a wrestler or as a real person.
Yeah.
And then one last shout out to Backstop. The only reason that Backstop ranks really high on my list is that he is the first Canadian member of the GI Joe team. He's the first international Joe. He's Canadian. He's from Montreal, which is where I'm from. And so I latched onto him as like a mascot character of mine. And so the reason he made it onto the active roster instead of plenty more valid candidates is because he was the one that I was like, no matter what, Backstop is making the cut here.
Nice. Vehicle.
Okay. The Hiss Tank, hands down. Like, I know when it comes to characters, I've got a million. But as far as just like the one most iconic vehicle in all of G.I. Joe, the Hiss Tank really has this cool design. And yet it's so simple, but like it's iconic. You immediately, when you look at it, you think back to G.I. Joe. There's no other vehicle in the line that does that. Like, most of the Joe vehicles were either like, that's just a tank, like that's something we see in the real life, or that's really weird, like the Buzzbore or the Rolling Thunder, things that it's like, they put a lot of fantasy into the military. But the Hiss Tank is the perfect overlap of like unique design, but also functionally militaristic enough that it works.
I couldn't agree more, to be honest. So, moving from military through to equestrian and equestria and small horses where friendship is magic and magic is power, and what was it like shifting from one property to, or from Joe's and reading over Transformers and then working on My Little Pony and bringing that side of the Essence20 system to life?
So when we were done with the development of the first 3 books, and Elisa was like, you know, you're all part of the Renegade family now. Anytime any of you want more work, let me know. We've got all of these other plans. And it's like, here are these other books for the G.I. Joe line we'd like people to be working on. Here's the Transformers line. Here's the Power Rangers line. And, you know, some people were crossing teams. Some people were really staying in their lane and just doing like a lot of the Transformers team just wanted to do Transformers stuff. And then here I was like, so nobody's working on the My Little Pony role-playing game? Like, I could totally be the Essence20 guy for the My Little Pony line. And Elisa was like, are you sure you don't want to do all these GI Joe products that we also need you on. It's like, I'd really like to, but like, I don't want to miss the opportunity to do My Little Pony. So they made an exception for me where everyone else was only allowed to work on one product at a time. Because, you know, if something happens, somebody burns out, whatever, then you only have to replace one person on one book. They let me work on 2 books at the same time, Cobra and the My Little Pony core rulebook. And so, yeah, there were certain days where I was like, what do you find in a bakery? Okay, great. How do you make a bomb? Great.
And Google just, search has gone wild.
Yeah, I know. You know that there's somebody just watching my Google searches like, what is he up to? Combine that with the fact that I have a couple of kids, they'll ask me weird questions and I'll be like, I don't know what you call an octopus beak. So let's also Google name of an octopus beak. And just my guy reading my Google searches like, what?
What's going on?
What is this? How does it all connect? It's got a whole board with like string tying the different things.
But staying with My Little Pony,
yes.
So what can we expect from the My Little Pony core rulebook within the Essence20 system?
So the big selling point, if you're interested in the crossover elements of the Essence20 system, is that we have a magic system in My Little Pony. And we haven't gone into details of how it works, so we can't talk about it yet.
Of course.
But I can say that this was one of the first things that I tackled just to make sure that everything else made sense. Because My Little Pony, there's like a lower familiarity with role-playing game expectation for the average player, which means that we didn't want to go as complex with some of the options. So like GI Joe and Transformers, you have your role and then you have your focus option. And that's just to give more and more options within any given option. My Little Pony, we didn't want to do that. We didn't want to do depth of options. We just wanted to do, here's really interesting thing, and here's the best way to play it out. There are some options within it, but nothing as big as now pick a second role within your one role. So a lot of the mechanics will be simplified. And in that way, we wanted a magic system that could be universally applied should magic come in to any of the other games. Like magic is an element in Power Rangers, for example. So theoretically, the magic system could show up in Power Rangers, and we wanted it to be the same magic system. And yet it had to be something that worked within the elements that we already added. We couldn't just say, and now there's a new magic skill, and just pretend that there's a magic skill that no other game has.
Yeah.
And so there was some clever, I'm saying clever, I'm the one who came up with it. So I was very clever in how I created a workaround that allowed you to invest into your magical abilities, learn new spells, and still stay within the framework of Essence20. And that is as much as I'm comfortable talking about there. Beyond that, it has been announced that the origins will just focus on your creature type. And this, when this comes out, Transformers won't be as weird as the one where the origin is like a bigger and different part of your character, because that was always supposed to be the plan, that, you know, if this was some kind of like if we did like a Ninja Turtles type role-playing game, this would be your creature type. Like, so it should be, or if we even just did a fantasy role-playing game, this would be your creature type, rather than just an aspect of your human personality, like in Power Rangers and GI Joe.
Yeah.
So origin will be tied to your creature type. In what I turned over, it was focused on ponies, but I believe that's because I didn't work on the whole book, and I didn't work with the team in that case. I just did the rules chunk, handed that over. A few months later, they actually brought me back in to do another rules chunk, but it hasn't been as collaborative as the GI Joe and just Essence20 system in general. So I don't know. I've heard rumors that they're going to be expanding beyond just unicorns, earth ponies, and Pegasi. Okay. But then, so one of the things that My Little Pony is going to focus on is that your influence will be tied to your cutie mark, which is a very important part of My Little Pony lore. It's not just, you know, a picture on their butt. It actually ties into their personality and implies that this is their destiny. And so your influences will be one of the ways that you can develop your cutie mark. And that will allow you to do things related to your influences and related to your cutie mark more easily than other things in the game. So there will be some restrictions because you don't have fingers, and so you're less. The way you interact with the rest of the world is more challenging than for human characters. But if it's related to your cutie mark and your talents, then you're a little bit better at that, and it kind of puts you on par with human characters and their pesky opposable thumbs.
Damn them! Well. With the 4 essences, the strength, speed, smarts, and social, that works across all 4 IPs now that we've sort of touched on each of them, the system has such flexibility that I know the Renegade Discord has the crossover chat, and there's
Yes.
pictures of. I think one of them was Optimus Prime and a couple of the My Little Pony characters, and there's so much. Go on, sorry.
What's wild is that of the 4 properties, GI Joe Transformers crossover regularly, like they have since the 80s. And in the cartoon, there were crossovers. There were some comics that were dedicated to crossovers. Towards the end of the original line, it was firmly established that they are in the same continuity. And since then, even as different publishers have had the license, they regularly cross over. And then the only other combination of these 4 properties that's officially crossed over is Transformers and My Little Pony. Like, you'd think Power Rangers would have crossed over with Transformers by now, but it's never officially happened. But My Little Pony Transformers has had 2 miniseries dedicated to it, and they're on my to-buy list. I have not picked them up yet. I kind of feel ashamed of that because from everything that I hear, they are really fun, and they do both properties really well.
That's amazing. Steering off Essence away from Renegade, going rogue,
sure.
Away from Renegade.
Going rogue.
Going.
Well, if we're going away from Renegade, we're like going with the system. We're like
conforming. So
there
conforming,
we go. Yes.
Falling into line somewhat, or is that a military? Anyway, moving on. Your work with Laughing Dragon Studios, you are the creative lead. What's it like to? So you're a freelance creator, you're a podcaster, podcast network person, creatively for Laughing Dragon Studios. How do you find time for all of this, and what's it like working with an animation or for an animation company?
2 very different questions of how I find time.
Sorry, I yes. So choose either, please.
Choose either. All right, we'll stick with how do I find time, just because that allows. That's the transition point from the Renegade stuff. So Renegade is where I'm doing the majority of my freelancing right now, and I'm doing much more freelancing now than I ever have before. And so this all started while I was working from home, so that was really handy because that meant that I saved an hour of my life not having to worry about commuting, and just it was easier to transition from like, all right, it was my work hour, now it's my lunch hour, so I can do a little work on freelance stuff, or I could just go upstairs and while I'm eating lunch, I could just watch some episodes of GI Joe, just get me back in the mood. So that helped a lot, and that's when I was working on the core rulebook. So that was the majority of when we needed to be doing meetings during the day, which I cleared with my boss because those are actually technically during my work time. So there was a little bit of flexibility and allowance for my day job boss, but for the most part, it was just cramming in like, here's an hour that I can do some freelance, here's an hour that I can do some more freelance. And I would do some work on computer, and then I do a lot of just handwritten notes.
Nice.
So that's when like I'm upstairs with my family because, like I said, I've got two young daughters. Now they're 5 and 7. So when the whole thing, both the pandemic and all this freelance work started, they were 3 and 5, and a lot of times they just want me in the same room with them, and so that's when the handwriting notes can start. So it was really just a matter of when can I find the time, when can I cram it in. And my wife kind of had the opposite situation as me. When the pandemic started, she is a scientist, and she was actually working on testing COVID tests. So just to make sure of the accuracy of COVID tests. So she was putting in 15-hour days, 6 days a week. And like I was watching the girls, getting my freelancing in whenever I could, sleeping, as much as possible, because I do believe sleep is really important for the creative process and just being healthy and all. So once she got over that, she was totally okay with me taking a lot more time than usual away from the family, because I let her do it, so she's letting me do it now. And as it's kind of evening out, I'm going to take a bit of a couple week break from Renegade assignments, because I just turned over one. I guess I turned over the last part of it this morning. So I've got a week off with no freelance stuff, so that's just going to be totally dedicated to some family things. But yeah, it's a matter of having a very supportive family, having just, I don't know, creative cramming, and that's it. Looking back, I'm not sure how I managed to do it all. Actually, no, you know what? So one of the things that did get sacrificed was my engagement with the network. So I am the director of logistics at the No Direction Network. I was the host of No Direction Podcast, which is the flagship of the show. As my Essence20 commitments came up, I did what I feel is the responsible thing, and I said I have to step back from some of my responsibilities. So I gave up the hosting duty of the podcast, even though like I've been doing it for 15 years. A lot of the reason I got this Renegade job was because of what I was doing with the podcast. But there was no way that I could fit everything in, and so I gave up my chair of the main podcast. I took a step back so that mainly what I'm doing now is just promoting everybody else in their work on the network, because we've got a staff of about 20 people. So I make sure that I'm still sharing to social media whenever they post their content and handling any logistics behind the scenes. But otherwise, that's the main chunk of my life that I took, that I put aside so that I had room for what was just like an absolute dream opportunity. So I couldn't say no to it.
Yeah, 100%. Totally understand that. We have covered a lot, and there is still probably hours worth of more questions, but I think we will have to save that for another time. But we have covered a lot. And is there anything we haven't covered in this period of time?
You did ask me about Laughing Dragon, and I have not touched on that at all. So just if people can go to tiktok.com/Laughing Dragon Studios, they can check out what our mascot Isaac and his roommates, a unicorn, a kraken, and a griffin are up to. Those are like 10-15 second shorts. They're TikTok videos, but we use those as samples for what we are able to do as an animation company. So even though it's free animation that people can watch online, it benefits us to put the most into them and to put our best foot forward in those and just get experimental and whatnot. So there's hours and hours of 15 second videos that people can check out just to get an idea of what my day job is at this point.
Yeah, well, I will make sure there's a link to that down in the description below. I will also put a link to the Laughing Dragon Studio website, which has just under 2-minute video, and shows who you're working with, your partners are, and I mean, there's Netflix and Nintendo and Square, so amazing animation studios and production companies. So
that's interesting. So there's a couple of names that we've worked with that you did not mention that if we had posted them up on the website, you would have absolutely mentioned first. So I guess we are not at liberty to discuss them yet. But basically, if it's a big name in the entertainment industry, there's a very good chance we have done some animation work for them.
Well, there's I'm scrolling across now. Activision, Blizzard, Apple Television, so Radio Canada.
Radio Canada. There is a bigger name than that. Picture the biggest name you can imagine. You might be right. Like that's how big some of our clients have been, and I've said enough. If it's not on the website, then we have a reason that it's not up there yet.
Fair enough. Well, the link to the website will be down in the description below this podcast, along with links to your own podcast network, the GI Joe stuff on the Renegade website, and anywhere and anything else I can find to link people to you and your content, Ryan. It has been a real pleasure to just be immersed, inducted almost into the GI Joe fandom by proxy through Essence20, and just somehow being involved in your shrine behind you. It's been a real pleasure to have you on the show, and I'd love to get you back in the future if you'd be willing to come back, of course.
Sure. How about when My Little Pony comes out? I can come back and talk about that in a little more detail.
Yeah, I'd love to hear how that sort of comes to fruition. That is the right word. I just wasn't sure if the context was correct. Yeah, absolutely. So until we get that released PDF or into the hard copies later this year, yeah, I would certainly love to get you back on the show if you'd be willing.
I'd be willing. This was a lot of fun.
All right. Thank you, Ryan, so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Adam.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about the show, then go to www.snydersreturn.squarespace.com. Alternatively, you can find us over on Twitter @ReturnSnyder. We have a Linktree link in the description of this episode. And if you want to support us, come and join us over on Patreon, and we also have a Discord server. Please leave us a review, because we'd love to learn how to improve the channel and provide better content out for those who are listening. Until we speak again, thank you.